We are going to take a little bit more of a serious turn since we have representatives from such august organizations who do so much amazing work, not just at Blue Hill at Stone Barns, but all over the world. So the question that I felt like I wanted to ask these two was why, with the reach and power of the institutions of NRDC and the Rockefeller Foundation, why is food waste such an issue? Like, why not maternal health? Why not child labor? Why food waste?
That's a great question, Julia. And it's so great to be here in this room with so many food advocates, by the way, for a really just and sustainable food system. At the end of the day, I think food system is the basis of civilization. If you can't get that right, you actually can't address all the other problems. And we're currently in such an incredible set of challenges facing us in the immediate future with 9 billion people coming on board. There's 70%, that if the current trends continue, that's 70% more food that we need, and we're just not going to be able to do that. So food waste is huge, as Danielle mentioned. It's 40% of food gets wasted. That's a lot of food. Like that's 340 pounds per person on average. So for the three of us, that's 1,000 pounds of food sitting there that we've wasted, and probably because we're Americans, we waste more. And that represents 66 trillion gallons of water. Food waste. If it was a country, food waste would be the third largest emitter of carbon dioxide after China and America, and the United States.
So not just food, but food waste.
Food waste, yes, food waste.
The things that are not used.
Yeah, food waste and food loss.
Wow.
So, we can't solve the problem of the environment without dealing with our food waste issues, and we can't feed the planet. And if you can't feed the planet, there's a lot of problems.
That's a big problem.
Yeah.
And Rhea, how would you answer that question for NRDC?
If I could maybe just build off of Roy's terrific answer, I think in addition to the fact that it is a significant contributor to all sorts of environmental issues, from greenhouse gas pollutions to water quality to toxicity in our own bodies, food's a fascinating issue because it's a connective issue. It's an issue that's so intimate and familiar, right? We are all familiar with and experienced in eating and choosing foods, and it's something that I think if we can do more events like this and have more conversations, we can get people to start thinking about their individual daily choices in a really different way, and that actually is quite additive. I think one of the more interesting movements in probably the last 20 or 30 years has been the food movement, and I think it's really been led by individuals making different choices that has ultimately resulted in the radical shift and transformation of the agricultural and food and restaurant industry. So I think it's a really exciting issue to connect with people on, and it's a really exciting issue to build those connections into larger, more rational policies overall.
And there's an emotional dimension to this. Sam Cass talks about how when you throw away food, it just feels wrong. Like, I mean, everybody who's done that, you've taken beautiful food and you throw it, there's something wrong about that. And I think we can all relate to that and know that we've got to shift that.
There's a special kind of guilt that comes with the CSA box. And what's left over, and you didn't use it, and you feel like a terrible person. But that is, of course, on a very high level of what we're talking about. And there's, the chef level and restaurants, but really, as I interviewed a Thomas Keller some years ago, asking him about food waste issues, and he pretty aggressively and assertively, and I thought bravely, said, with the number of people that I feed, I don't really think this should be my problem. It's like, I will do what I can, but someone else should be in charge. This should be the work of the world and of world governments. Like, who should be in charge? So obviously, you guys are not government agents. You are, in some ways, working within the system. Who do you think should be in charge?
So I think the question of who's in charge is a pretty fascinating question right now. NRDC has had a long history. Yeah, I know. I promised I wouldn't bring up Donald Trump, but I don't know, I guess it's inevitable. But so NRDC has been working for our entire history, mainly on federal policies, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, et cetera. Clearly, we're seeing a massive attack on those kind of fundamental statutes that kind of create the quality of life or the standard of living that I think most of us have assumed is our right. Getting any new federal policy is probably not in the cards in the immediate future. And so NRDC over the last couple of years, and actually even before that, thanks to a lot of help from leaders like the Rockefeller Foundation, we've pivoted to think about different nodes of opportunities specifically at the subnational level. So I'm talking about states and I'm talking about cities. And one of the great things about cities is it's where we live. It's where we live, it's where we consume, it's where our families are, and the opportunities to create policies at a city level that both directly impact people's lives and that are innovative, creative, a little bit kind of outside of the box. There are enormous amount of mayors that I think are trying to figure out how do I bring sustainability to my constituents and how do I think about that in a multifaceted.
Can you give us an example of one of those statewide or citywide programs that you feel is working?
Sure. So I think that in communities like Denver or in Baltimore, we're working, again, with the mayor's office, but working with a kind of a network of nonprofits to try to figure out how food at a municipal level, food waste at a municipal level can be reduced. And that both entails some degree of recycling, right? So if there's just better systems and you know that there's food that's going uneaten in a school system or in, again, some other government system, is there a way to more expeditiously or just more directly make sure that food is consumed somewhere else in the system, whether it's homeless shelters or other, again, social services. And so it's just connecting the dots in a way that I think governments have the ability to do, particularly at that level, but doing it in a way that hopefully adds up. I think we're quite interested at some point in time in getting back to the idea that there could be some more rational labeling on food. Food labeling is just, it really is meaningless and mostly up to the manufacturer, right? So there's, at least 10 different schools of thought about what these dates mean or why they're on products. That ultimately should be a federal policy solution because it's really hard to do that at a local level. Mm-hmm. But I think if you prove the concept at a local level, both the demand and the ability to, in some ways, change behavior without asking for a lot of sacrifice, I think that's a really good lesson to try to build national emphasis for policy reform.
Let's just talk about that a little bit, and then I promise we'll open the lens. But I am. This is one of my personal bugbears: is the expiration dates, especially on dairy and eggs and things like that. How did I mean? That has changed a little bit, right? Over the last 7 or 8 years, there was an adjustment. Can you tell us a little bit about that, either of you, or how it happened?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if you're more familiar with the kind of...
Because I know getting those things changed is almost impossible. Like the USDA is a very slow ship.
It is a very slow ship, although we were making progress in the previous administration, right? And I think that, again, this connectivity issue of people demanding it, you can't, I still, despite the circumstances, believe that there's opportunity for rational government behavior at some point in time, and I think that that's the easiest solution. Now, how that came to be, again, I think it's some combination of individual corporations deciding that they're going to put an expiration date on something that, it helps either move the product faster.
Right, there's absolutely no regulation.
No, there's nothing, with the exception of, I think, baby formula. Really, those expiration dates are completely meaningless, and yet people really use those as guides of, oh, I haven't even opened this package of eggs, but it's 1 day past the expiration date. I should just throw it away. And so part of the work that we're doing in trying to educate the consumer is educating them on those labels don't matter, and educating them to take power in their own hands to figure out like how they can determine what's gone bad or what hasn't gone bad. And it's usually the basic senses of smell, sometimes taste, sometimes look, right? I mean, most of us innately have some sense of that. We've evolved over the course of many, many hundreds of thousands of years to develop
not
those
eat
senses.
food that is unsafe.
Right. So trusting yourself and getting a little bit of guidance is a large part of what we hope, again, can start to transform this.
Yeah, I just find it heartbreaking how many people I know who just will throw out yogurt or eggs. Eggs will last almost indefinitely. Ultra pasteurized milk lasts almost indefinitely. And we've developed, I mean, these are things that could be, huge assets. And anyway, okay, I'll stop. That's just my thing.
I have another.
You want to add to that? Okay.
Add to something to your skeptical chef question, because the food waste, and like so many things in the food system, it's this hairy, complex issue which requires everybody to be involved. The idea that we send messages into society that really disempowers so many people. What I do doesn't really matter, and that's just false, and especially false, for a chef who. As you could see, Dan Barber has he's a chef and he has incredible ability to shift norms and patterns. And when we've worked, we've had a number of initiatives that have worked with chefs to kind of change the way they work with food in kitchens. And the World Wildlife Fund developed this fantastic toolkit. It's hotelkitchen.org. And you can go in there and apply all of these different things to actually make pretty significant changes in the amount of waste that a kitchen delivers. And so the idea, and if you do that over the thousands and thousands of kitchens, chef, that's a much bigger pile than our 1,000 pounds of food over there.
Sure, but I think, based on the research that I've been reading, restaurants, and as they have traditionally been, are actually very low waste because they need to make money, and their food costs are enormous, and that's why they use the nose of the pig. It's not because they love the nose of the pig and the nose to tail and the root to stem necessarily. It also affects their bottom line enormously. So traditionally, restaurants, in terms of what they prepare, are not that wasteful, but there is a ton of stuff that they cannot use once it's been on a plate, once it's been in a bread basket. And that is even worse in hotels, those huge buffets. That all has to be thrown out if it hasn't been eaten. So that's another way to look at it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the difference in your programs with food waste and food loss. I think that's an important distinction. Maybe everyone in this room knows about it, but I'm not sure the world at large does.
So food loss is basically all of the food, the biomass, food that is lost in the early parts of the supply chain. So harvesting, post-harvest, transport, all of those things. Once it gets to the retail and consumer level, food waste is what gets edible food that could have been used that gets thrown out.
So food that is lost never even makes it to the marketplace.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then, and what's interesting about that is that in the emerging markets, most of the food that's lost is in the early part of the supply chain because of poor transport and all of those. In the Western world, that is the majority is actually much closer to the consumer and the retail end.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about the program that the Rockefeller Foundation has done in Africa for limiting food loss.
So we launched something we called YieldWise, which is working with key value chains, mango value chain, the maize value chain in East Africa, and it essentially works with on a number of pillars to kind of levers to change the level of food loss. And we've been very successful. Within the first year, they've reduced losses of mangoes by 20% and maize by 35%. And it's working with aggregating farmers together, providing them with technologies that they may not have had access to, such as silos and cold storage, providing financing mechanisms, and then a lot of education because people need to learn. And so it's a systemic, you have to intervene at multiple points in the supply chain in order to have real impact. But we've demonstrated that that's possible, and there's a good return on investment, and that can make a huge difference to to farmers and consumers. You know, in one of my previous lives, I funded a lot of breeding work, and it can take 10 years to get a new breed of maize to give you a 15% increase in yield, or less. And within 1 year, you can get a 20% reduction in loss. I mean, the return on that is so much greater, and it really is, quote unquote, no pun intended, a low-hanging fruit, and we should go out and do more.
And in that program, you're trying to do it without the technology that makes it possible, say, you know, in the Western United States with enormous refrigerated train cars and automated harvesting. You know, these farmers don't have those kinds of tools.
Well, there are certainly not as much access to that, but there are lots of different methods out there and some really interesting new technologies. Some of you may have heard of, like, Appeal Sciences has this coating made out of natural lipids that can extend shelf life of fresh vegetables, avocados, for example, by 10 days. If we can get that into these supply chains, it's fully organic. It could really change the nature of those processes.
I think avocado waste would be a big issue.
Yeah.
For the millennials. And for everyone, because the avocado monitoring situation is very difficult for people, especially in my house, at least. And then in addition to the food loss, you have your food waste program, the hotel and restaurant training. So can you tell us a little bit about how that actually works? What are the nuts and bolts?
So a lot of it's really started, we work with the World Wildlife Fund, with ReFed, to develop these zero waste programs. And hotels that have been, and the hospitality industry that has been able to adopt this, you know, they've implemented all kinds of programs around green challenge weeks. And if you go to the hotelkitchen.org, you can see a lot of those examples.
But I mean, these big hotel chains are not serving like carrot top pesto and broccoli leaf salad, I bet. What are they doing?
Well, just starting to measure if you're not aware of it, you actually don't do anything about it. And so being aware of what is going on is like number one. The second is just, you know, people want to stop wasting. And if they have specific ways to do that, either, you know, creating smaller plates or not putting as much out on the table or doing all kinds of awareness training, that actually makes a big difference. IKEA did this program, just doing those sorts of things across their 400 stores. They have 400 restaurants, and within 12 weeks, 35% reduction in food loss, and that seems to be pretty doable in a lot of these large chains,
especially with the huge portions that a lot of them indulge in. We're going to take some questions in a minute. I just had one more question for Rhea, just in terms of, you guys did your big study, Wasted, in 2012, and then again in 2017. And I guess I would ask you, what is the single thing that you would want this audience to know about what changed or what didn't change, what needs work, what needs to be expanded or minimized?
So I actually think the biggest change actually is reflected in the audience itself. It's this rising awareness and engagement and interest and action on food that, again, people are literally taking matters into their own hands, right? And the amount of interest we've seen on our own sites, both for the book as well as for kind of the tips that we have on those pages on our website, they outperform anything else. People are just really hungry for this information, and I think they're using the information, and they're becoming active around it. And for me, in thinking about the kind of larger array of environmental issues that we work on, everything from climate change to ocean pollution, again, this opportunity of kind of connecting with people where they're at and really trying to get them energized and active on an issue can hopefully stem into activity on lots of other issues. So I think there's been a really palpable and measurable increase in just the awareness and the excitement.
The ripple effect.
That's right.
That brings us here. So let's bring the lights up and we'll take questions. It feels so powerful when that happens. You got your hand up first in the middle, so I'm going to call on you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Kate McKenzie, and I'm with City Harvest.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Sure. Kate McKenzie with City Harvest. I have a question, actually, I think most for Roy, but Rhea, I'm interested in your perspective. In your opening comments, you mentioned, the sort of fearful question of how do we feed the world with its growing population. And it seems to be a bit at odds or at tension with the reality, number one, of course, of the amount of food that is wasted, but also seems to imply sort of this sort of prime indicator around yield trumping all. But I'm just wondering how you can speak to how we're supporting sort of the smaller scale productions, both in this country and across the world, who are more feeding their local communities and not necessarily with an eye towards mass production.
So I'm happy, I think there has been traditionally far too much emphasis on yield and quantity, right? And I think Dan, rather than all the other things we need to optimize for, which it's not just flavor, but environmental impact and the impact on communities and implication of all of these new technologies. It's one of the things that we're starting to develop a whole initiative around is we need much more nutrient-rich, nutrient-dense food. And that includes everything from the sustainable protein to a lot more. We are deficit, globally we're deficit in fruits and vegetables and seeds and nuts. These are highly nutritious, and they have not been emphasized, and they have not gotten the level of research that we actually need. So, I agree with that. There's this, we need not so much emphasis on quantity, but a lot more on quality and nutrition. And it's odd, it's super odd. It's the same sort of way, that Dan talks about how breeders have not been asked to breed for flavor. Many breeders have not been asked to breed for nutrition. They've been asked to breed for just with this quantity, shippability. What about the nutrient quality of the food that you're growing? And there are breeders who are starting to do that, but I think that's a big shift, and we need to do that, and we need to move, that there's pretty significant shifts in the food system that we need, as a result, can be created.
Okay. Anyone? You're there, right there? Thanks. And remember to end with a question mark. That's good advice from Danielle.
Hi, I'm Ali Chaclair from Further with Food. I'm just wondering about the Food Matters program, and when you're looking at city programs, what sort of strategies you're seeing are most successful. Sometimes I wonder if too much consumer education puts too much onus on the consumer, and if I don't know if there are other strategies that you're finding are more successful, like policy change or infrastructure change.
So I hear you on your point of maybe putting too much onus on the consumer, and I have kind of a particular pet peeve about that when it comes to things like sunscreens, right? Every summer, before the summer starts, I'm like on that EWG website looking at all the different kinds of sunscreens that I can choose to put on my daughter's face, and I just think there's something wrong with that, right? There's something wrong with a system that puts the burden on me to prevent toxicity for my daughter in commercially sold products at CVS, right? Like, I just feel like we've got to get to a point where there is responsibility that it's taken, and that responsibility is manifested in rational, humane, sustainable policies. So I hear you. I think The opportunity at the city level isn't necessarily about regulations, although they could come up with different kinds of policy regulations that impact things like composting or whatnot for restaurants. I think the opportunity at cities that I see that could be really exciting is, again, connecting perhaps the consumer end side of the supply chain in a more efficient and meaningful way. In the same vein as the last question around, we have this crazy system that kind of creates more and greater yields, and yet simultaneously we have children in our own communities that are hungry. So again, being able to look at a city in a really concrete way and trying to figure out how to connect those dots to solve multiple problems at the same time, I think is a more innovative way to think about how government can work for people. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be promulgated into policies.
I actually have a follow-up question on that, because I feel like, as with many messages about consumer choice, for example, if you want to minimize food waste, should we be buying bread with more preservatives so we don't throw away so much bread? Should we be buying ultra-pasteurized milk, even though that does not take us back to the flavor of milk and what milk is supposed to be? And those are, so there seem to often be conflicting values in, how can we, what should we buy, what should we eat, how can we do it best?
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think it is challenging. I have experienced that kind of dilemma in the aisles of grocery store and trying to figure out what to choose and how to make the best choices. And I guess the only thing I can say is I think giving people more tools to make the kinds of choices that can make a difference is where we've at least started as an organization.
Yeah.
And ultimately, moving towards just a different way of buying and consuming, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be like the 50-gallon can of chili that you get at Costco, but the grocery store trip that gives you 3 days of food, and you can kind of appropriately apportion it. Right? So it's also a different way of consuming that we are, I think, challenged.
Well, I hope you will keep working on that.
And just to add, I think there's a lot of dichotomous thinking. It's either this or that, and I think we're not pulling in human ingenuity to design better products, better services. And that's why I actually think designers have a tremendous role to play in figuring out how we design a better, so many parts of this food system.
Yeah, there are too many moving parts. Yeah. All right, I'm so sorry. Apparently, we are out of time. But thank you all so much for coming. Thank you guys for joining us.